So we are going to talk about, for understanding evidence-based medicine, you join many dots and many papers together and we critically appraise our understanding of a particular disease and then think whether we want to actually move ahead with what new changes are being suggested or not. So, the really wrong way of understanding published papers is straight away uploading the paper to AI and asking it, what do you think about it? Because the AI really doesn't think, as we all know, it is predicting the next word. AI does not have curiosity like humans. And even if AGI or artificial general intelligence comes and AI becomes curious, what it's going to lack is, the want to do better, because it has no interest in, whether things are getting better or not. So we need to not outsource our judgments, right? So fast answers can create shallow thinking, but a fluent answer, very important to remember, is not always the right answer, right? And we are very used to a very fluent world now, right? Everything is at beck and call. But a lot of the times that's not the right answer. So let's not offload our basic judgment to paper. So the real wrong way is to actually go ahead and ask AI, okay, this is the paper, now tell me about it. Right? So there has to be a method to the madness, and that's what we'll try and understand. So what the best way is to read the paper yourself, try and make sense of it in as much time as you have. First, understand the study design. And it's relatively simple to understand whether it's a prospective or a retrospective study, whether it's a randomized or a non-randomized trial and things like that. So let's understand study designs. I won't go into the details, but you can easily identify what kind of study it is. Then use some checklists, and these are really available very freely. And you can actually ask the AI to say, okay, now what is the study design and what checklist should we use to analyze this paper, right? And that will give it the structure that you're looking for, right? So identify the checklist. Try and match the paper to it with the use of AI if you want, and perhaps even without the use of AI, and then apply your judgment to what the AI is telling you, right? So this is basically a framework. Instead of just going all and sundry and asking the AI, "Bhai, tujhe kya pata hai?" You give it a framework. So the framework first as a checklist, and then start using the AI on top of the checklist. It's a structured questions will produce more useful, auditable reasoning for your own mind. So start with the study design. As we all know, they could be randomized trials, cohort studies, case control studies, sometimes diagnostic studies where you look at sensitivity, specificity, and then of course there are systematic reviews as well, right? So your prompt to the AI is first identify the study design and explain why. Why do you say it's a prospective or a retrospective study? And of course AI will get this right most of the times. Then we go to find the right checklist, right? So the AI might give you a checklist, and then if you are already aware of some checklist, you might say, oh, this perhaps doesn't look like the right one or the right version of it. Right? So different study designs require different approaches, right? As we know, CONSORT is for randomized trials, PRISMA is for systematic reviews, there is STROBE for observational studies, there is TRIPOD, there is START, there are so many others. So currently there are more than 600 checklists. So it's almost impossible for us to remember all of them. But then, the top 10 or 12 that we are using very frequently should be at the tip of your tongues if you're doing this regularly. So AI can help identify the appropriate reporting guideline. If not AI, you can do it yourselves. This is the EQUATOR network website, and then you can go to that website and essentially do it yourself as well. So these are some of the commonly used ones which are here. And then so this is an example of a STROBE checklist which is used for evaluating a published paper, which is a prospective observational study. And a retrospective observational study, which a lot of us do, is called the record checklist. So you'll have something like this: introduction, background, then objectives, then method. So you can basically just tell the AI, so what is item number 2 in this paper? Then what is item number 3 in this paper? And if you don't understand, try and asking it a few more times, and you can say, make it easier, or give me a regular analogy, or I'm not able to understand that, or this. So when you go through all the 21 questions in this checklist, you will have a far better catch of what the paper is doing, and also identify what it is not doing, right? So checklist really is the starting point, right? It's really not the answer. So you say you're looking at randomization and the CONSORT checklist, you ask, was it described in this paper? And many times you will find that how randomization was done was not at all described. Then what was done, right? And then could this influence the outcome? So if this was not done, say masking is not explained at all. So there are 3 processes. RAM is randomization, allocation, and masking. So there has to be enough detail of all the 3. Okay, now if there is no details of masking, you will identify that perhaps that is more important than randomization for a particular study. Now, what is the influence of that on the outcome? And could this outcome be just because there was no masking, because the authors haven't presented that data to you? So something like that. Then reporting is not equal to methodological quality. People may report it very well. So what was reported basically is purpose, questions answered, and the tool that we're using, right? The typical tools, that is the CONSORT and on the EQUATOR network. But now, are the outcomes, that is the results, trustworthy? Can I trust it? Can I take it to my clinics? There are different set of things. It's basically looking at it from your own practicality point of view. In that, there are Rob and Robbins and a few others, which we won't go much into the details. But for RCTs, we call it Rob, or risk of bias. Right? How much is there bias in this randomized trial? Right? And then non-randomized trials, we call it Robbins, or bias from confounding and selection. Right? So if so we say, okay, we did this treatment and then that treatment, and we're comparing, but the two groups are not at all comparable at baseline, and that perhaps defeats the whole study, right? Then what's the point of then saying, if one group had poorer endothelial count at baseline than the other, and then you say, okay, that fell more, then can you say that group which already started with the worst endothelial count is poorer in surgery, right? So if you say SICS is worse than FACO, it could be SICS is far more older patients with already lower counts, endothelial counts, things like that. So don't blame SICS for that, right? So that will come up when you look at Robbins, or there are others like Quads and Amster. I won't go much into the details, but key message here is the paper can be well reported and still have risk of bias, right? So the EQUATOR network, all check boxes are ticked, but yet it is not applicable to your own settings, right? So reporting guidelines improve the description, but that appraisal, it's not exactly the final appraisal tool either, right? So trustworthiness is what you will, so you can ask questions like, you ask AI, you are trying to break down that paper, right? So AI is most useful when you ask, to explain unfamiliar concepts. So you'll say in plain language, explain this to me in plain language. Give me a similar clinical example. Say for example, randomization, what most authors will use is sealed, opaque, sequentially numbered envelopes. So you're not exactly able to understand what this means, or, so you say, okay, give me another example. Right? Or, why is it mattering so much here? So it reduces selection bias. So AI will tell you all of those things, right? So randomization, allocation, and masking, why are all of these important for the study design? And then, AI will tell you. So the prompt could be explain allocation concealment to a clinician with an example who really hasn't done much research themselves. So can it be a statistical tutor is the next question, right? So you've gone through the introduction methods, perhaps a few other things. Now, statistics is something which is slightly harder to understand. So you already need to be aware of few concepts before understanding what AI tells you, because AI will tell you a lot of things. But then, like a statistician is sending you a statistical analysis report, which is like 40 page worth, and you are not able to make head or tail of that. Same way, the AI output of statistics from a paper might be even more overwhelming, right? So knowing some basic terminologies very much helps. So, knowing things like what is 95% confidence interval, what is the area under the curve, odds ratios, interaction terms, p-values, regression analysis, these are very basic terms, right? So you can actually ask AI to explain the concept, until it clicks, right? Say for example, area under the curve can be explained with many different examples, like an umbrella and people under the umbrella, and the size of the umbrella and things like that. So what does 95% confidence mean is confidence interval communicate both magnitude and uncertainty. Let me give you an example. Say, you will say the vaccine has say 80% or say 85% effectiveness. Now the confidence interval may vary from say 69% to 95%. Now that lower mark is 69%. So if you conducted the study 100 times over, some populations you may have only 69% effectiveness. And in some populations, you may have 96% effectiveness. Now that is too low, right, for us. Say there is another one which has the same effectiveness, say 85%, but that varies from 82 to 87%. Now there, I think we should be far more, though both are the same, but then the confidence interval in the other one is far variable, right? So that's a concept which we should understand, and then AI will be able to explain it to us better. So the more precise one is the smaller one, the larger precise one is, perhaps not the better thing to do. So don't just ask, whether it crosses a threshold, so ask, what is the interval and what it allows you to conclude. So AI will tell you that vaccine A is better than vaccine B because the confidence interval is such. Right, so ask AI to change the explanations until it clicks in your mind, right? So it could be technical, it could be a clinical example, it could be an analogy, like I've shown the umbrella here, right? So you need to ask AI in very different ways, try to understand it, right? So the prompt could be explain a 95% confidence interval technically, then with a clinical example, then with an analogy. Again, area under the curve, I won't go much into the details of it, but the higher the area under the curve, the better the discrimination, right? But then that does not mean sensitivity or specificity, right? So we need to understand what some of these terminologies are. So prompt is explain AUROC without mathematics, right? Then with a clinical example. you still definitely therefore need the vocabulary in statistics, right? So EQUATOR network gives you all the other vocabularies, but the statistical vocabulary you need to sort of inculcate yourselves over time. So AI helps when you know enough to challenge it. So using useful interpretations, informed questioning, plausible answers. So what it gives, are you happy with it? Do you want it to explain more, right? And then if you have no concept, you accept whatever sounds fluent or great, right? And we don't want to be in that position, right? You want to be in the topmost position. So you need to still educate yourselves about some basic statistical concepts. So remember, vocabulary turns AI from an answer machine to a thinking partner. We are not wanting to offload it, but we want to think along with it, right? Ask better statistical questions therefore. So understand the basics, then what is slightly better, and therefore the best question. So what is a p-value is a basic question. Interpret this 95% confidence interval around the p-value is a better question. The best question is, does the effect size and confidence interval support the author's clinical claim, right? Something like that. So that's a better question. Then we can come back to checklists, and then you can look at what is primary outcomes, statistical methods, results, and bias and interpretation. So checklist will help you look what statistics perhaps misses, and then the check boxes will help you critique. Oh, this is not there. And so it's not just simple yes no. It's like, was blinding reported, who was blinded, how was blinding maintained, could lack of blinding influence the outcome, things like that, right? So checklists become useful only when they are triggering critique in your mind. So ask AI to argue against the paper. So regular prompt is ask a skeptical, act as a skeptical peer reviewer. What are the strongest arguments against the validity of this paper? Let's try to break it down as much as you can. Is there bias? Is there some confounding, attrition, too much loss to follow up, generalizability is not great, things like that. So AI can, if the AI is only summarizing the paper, then it is not appraising it, right? So we need to ask it these questions. Remember, good reporting does not rescue bad design, right? So if the hypothesis is weak and it's a biased sample, reporting quality and methodology are related but definitely not identical. Critical appraisal should end with a question. Okay, so there is a finding, there is this limitation which now have found out. Perhaps there is some uncertainty. Is there a research question hidden behind it that I can pursue? So, the critique that stops at weakness is therefore incomplete. It should point towards what to study next for ourselves as well as for those authors. So turn that limitation into a research idea. From a published paper to an unanswered question in your mind to then candidate for a new study, right? So has someone already answered that question though? So Dr. Devashi's talk nicely told us about the candidate question, AI-assisted literature search, finding the gap, and then refining the question. Right? So the novelty should be verified and not assumed. So AI can help with screening overall, but the final judgment is still ours, right? And then convert that idea into the PICO approach, the population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. So that's the study design. And from the PICO to study design basically goes through all these, where you design the study, you determine the primary outcome, the effect measure, and the analysis plan. Lastly, the sample size. We need to give AI the right information for it to spit out the sample size within seconds. But that information is very important. What is a clinically meaningful difference? What is the variability in terms of standard deviations and others? What is the alpha? What is the power of the study I'm targeting? What is the expected attrition or loss to follow up? So, list the inputs required before calculating the sample size for the study, right? So we can't just tell AI, okay, this is what I want to do and this is the previous paper and let's do this, right? Because you need to then give it all those other information that you have. So the entire workflow, I think, goes through identify the study design, find that checklist, understand all the concepts that you, as far as you can, and otherwise use AI to understand them first, then appraise the results, then try and identify the gap, right? Oh, this has been done, but this still isn't done. And then build your study question around it using the PICO approach, choose the right design, again with the help of AI, and then estimate your sample size. So AI can help in each of these ways, but most importantly, our human judgment is the most important. So let's not offload that. So AI can support every step, right? But that responsibility finally never leaves the researcher. So use AI to think better and not less. We can do more. So the goal is not faster answers, it is better reasoning. Understand, interrogate, break it down, ask questions, and then create something that is even more valuable than what you came across. So the framework first, AI second, and always judgment is what I think is the thought process that I'm trying to inculcate in all of you, right? So AI should augment evidence-based thinking, definitely not replace it. Thank you so much.